This is the 8th decade. We're looking at 100 years in the United Church. And we've been looking at the church life in the context of Canada's life, Indigenous connections, one publication that the church wanted people to read, and we'll sing a hymn written in the era. The scripture reading from Isaiah this morning that Arthur read said, "Do not cling to the events of the past or dwell on what happened long ago. Watch for the new thing I am going to do. It is happening already. You can see it now." The decade starting in 1995 was full of new things, both in the church and the country and in the wider world. It was a whole new reality. Dolly the sheep was born in this era. Scientific breakthrough that proved geneticists could clone an adult mammal, giving rise to a new era of genetic experimentation and ethical debate. Chris Hadfield became the first Canadian commander of the International Space Station, spending 144 days in space. And we had the millennium bug. The world was now so connected by computers and dependent on them that there was fear that when the clock struck midnight on January 1st, 2000, Y2K, that affected computer systems unsure of the year would fail to operate and cause massive power outages, transportation systems shut down, banks to close, planes would drop from the skies. Widespread chaos would ensue. We were actually well prepared for an apocalypse that did not happen, but the warnings for the future were there. The first book and movie of Harry Potter hit the world with all its struggle and magic, and children were suddenly interested in reading again. Trading cards and anime cartoons from Japan created a global phenomenon among children and youth. Computer words were rapidly being added to the dictionary. World Wide Web, .com. Google became a verb for how to find things on the web. And individuals and companies and churches were all trying to figure out how to build a website to make themselves seen by everyone in the world. Out with the VHS tapes that always got stuck in the machine, and in with information on DVDs, and now no one knew how to put all their movies on a disc. The toonie joined the loony, and suddenly a handful of change was worth something. Another word added to the dictionary in this era was flexitarian, for vegetarians who occasionally ate meat. Huge money went into the diet wars at this time. Low carb, low glycemic, paleo. More varieties of food were becoming available than we had ever seen before. Canada had an entire television network dedicated to watching shows about food and its preparation. Style-wise, wild-colored hair made it onto the scene in neon blues, yellows, greens, and pinks, or as little color as possible in the emo and goth cultures that sought to personify expressiveness and emotional authenticity and dark introspection. No longer just for sailors or convicts or culturally symbolic traditions. People started decorating their bodies with tattoo art that they liked. And the pierced of the earlier decades began to be more shocking as body modification and piercing moved other places than the ear. The Matrix movie explored the question of the decade: what is real? And following up on the question of what is real, Canada released the beloved ads about the house hippo. It was a public service announcement about the importance of questioning what you're seeing in the media, because it can be digitally manipulated. Canadian music was not just Anne Murray all day, every day anymore. It was enjoying widespread accolades and a global reach in every genre. From Inuk pop singer Susan Aglukark's OCM, We Are One Family, to Leonard Cohen touring the globe to sell out audiences everywhere. The Celine Dion's powerful pipes were unleashed in English. There was punk feminist icon Avril Lavigne, country and pop superstar Shania Twain, K.D. Lang winning awards for country and pop and rock, the tragically hip rock bands that Canadians loved, and post-grunge alternative rock of Nickelback, a band that people loved to hate but enjoyed incredible success. In this decade, Canadian music was having its day all over the world. On the political front, sexual orientation was added to the protections under the Canadian Human Rights Act. And following that, the United Church urged the Canadian Parliament to vote in favor of the same-sex marriage legislation. The Civil Marriage Act was introduced and passed, making Canada the fourth country to legalize same-sex marriages. Soon afterwards, United Church boards and congregations were being approached by lesbian and gay couples in their congregations and from outside to solemnize and celebrate marriages for them. Early in this era, there was a tense month-long standoff off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. The Canadian Coast Guard seized the Spanish fishing trawler Este, firing warning shots across its bow, claiming that the vessel was illegally overfishing turbot just outside the 2-mile limit. The relationship between Canada and Spain became so tense that Spain sent a warship to protect its fishermen. After a month of tension and negotiation with the EU, the dispute ended. Quebec held a referendum to settle a long, simmering debate to determine if the province should be a separate and sovereign nation. The no vote won by a razor-thin margin of 50.56%. The Confederation Bridge was built to connect Prince Edward Island to the mainland. Almost 13 kilometers long, it is the longest bridge over ice-covered water in the world. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People released its final report on the evolution of the relationship with Canada and Indigenous peoples. It recommended sweeping changes on issues like Indigenous governance and self-determination, increased Indigenous land base and the formation of an Aboriginal Parliament, as well as reforms that would address Aboriginal health, education, employment, and housing needs. 20 years later, many of these recommendations have not been adopted by the federal government. During this time, hearings were being held on the effects of residential schools on individuals and communities. For the first time in many people's memories, stories of the destructiveness of that school system on communities and individuals were being brought into the light. The Canadian government settled some financial claims and established a healing foundation to provide community-based and survivor-focused healing projects across the country. The United Church, who was part of that system, also launched a campaign to raise $1 million for a healing fund. It would support the fund initiative to help heal the impact of residential schools on survivors, their families, and communities. September 11th, terrorist attacks by planes devastated New York City and Washington, D.C. Canada launched Operation Yellow Ribbon to help flights destined for the U.S. when they shut down airspace. Over 200 planes landed in Canada, with Halifax receiving the largest number of flights and Vancouver the largest number of passengers. But most famously, Gander, Newfoundland took in more than 6,000 people, a town of only 10,000, and there were 500 hotel rooms. Gander became the face of Canadian support and hospitality. In the wake of that attack, Canada entered military operations in Afghanistan, the largest military deployment since World War II. 44 people in Toronto died from a highly contagious lung infection we called SARS. It made us aware of global viral threats and our preparation levels. On the West Coast, Robert Willie Picton was charged in the murder of 26 women at his pig farm in Port Coquitlam. He claimed to have killed 49. The investigation was a flashpoint into the wider issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the failures of police in investigating them. The United Church launched the Beads of Hope campaign, a 2-year campaign as an emergency response to the global AIDS pandemic. It was about education, advocacy, and changes to public policy. The church hoped to raise $1 million, and by the end of two years, it had raised more than double that. In this era, we also welcomed a new hymn book. With more modern and Canadian music, many of the old favorites, prayers and psalms, and updated language, it was a welcome change from the earlier Red Book. And in a sermon that former moderator Lois Wilson wrote for the church's 75th anniversary, she told her congregation that the United Church's initial vision of becoming a national church for Canada was no longer going to happen. She wrote this: "We used to be so intertwined with the Canadian culture that we appeared in the writings of Canadian writers like Alice Munro, Margaret Atwood, and Robertson Davies. We were as Canadian as maple syrup. How do we react to this loss of being part of the cultural landscape? Some deny it has happened. Others wax nostalgic. Some blame the leadership. And United Church folk are likely to hug each other." She told them, in this next era, in the new thing, we need a few things. We need faith. We need biblical literacy. We need to complete things that we have started, like our commitments to Indigenous people. We need to accept others and partner with them. Not just my best friend is an Anglican, but to work with other churches and other faith groups and organizations that share our values and our vision. We need to resist the cultural norms of our times, resist the violence, the greed, the disdain of human beings, civil wars. The gospel of Jesus is about destabilizing convention. And if we talked about destabilizing convention, we got it in our new national moderator, Bill Phipps. A short few months after he was elected in this decade, he found himself on the cover of Maclean's magazine. Not only did he support gay ordination and champion economic justice for the poor, but he questioned the resurrection of Jesus as a scientific fact, added that he was undecided on the question of the afterlife, and said in an interview, "I don't believe Jesus was God." In many United Church circles, he wasn't seen as particularly radical. Many scholars and lifelong learners in the church challenged a literal picture of a white-robed Christ who walks on water and has dubious supernatural powers. And they proposed instead a portrait of a more human Jesus. Bill sparked people on both sides of the debate. Some were saying, if the church is going to open up and start to make sense, I'll come back. Others said, if we lose what we have, I'm leaving. Who wants to go to church and ask what they believe? And the answer is, we're debating that. When the article appeared a couple of weeks before Christmas, Bill said to his congregation in Calgary, "The truly remarkable thing is there are literally thousands of conversations taking place at the dinner table, at the workplace, wherever people gather, conversations about Jesus." And a document the church wanted people to read in this decade wanted people to talk about Jesus and the Bible. It was a statement on the authority and the interpretation of Scripture. And the report encouraged ministers to take the risk to teach people about the Bible, to give them good scholarly resources, to take the Bible seriously when preaching, and learn how to educate all ages about the Bible. The report said that engaging the Bible is not optional for the Christian community. It needs to happen. Whether we study the Bible in groups, or read it on our own, or hear the Bible in worship, or sing it in our hymns, Christians need to know the Bible. The report asked some good questions. Why do people who have so much knowledge and ability to carry out complicated tasks at home and work remain at a child's level of understanding of the Bible? Why do we professionalize the Bible and leave it in the hands of the minister and not all the people? We all should study it. And we need to know how to interpret it. Not just to open it and take it at face value, but to know both the culture the Bible came from and the culture we are steeped in while we're reading it. The report wrote this: "The Bible contains the story that helps shape us into the community we are. A community that extends both in time and geography to include all who have undertaken this journey of faith. The Bible is the foundational story for us as we attempt to understand life, God, and relationships. It is our story, inspired by the Spirit, hallowed by the continual use of the ongoing community through which we discover God's living word. And in this era, with all these new things happening, congregations and their ministers became acquainted with a model of faith that was very old, 200 years old. Formed by John Wesley, one of the founders of the Methodist Church, it was called the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, and explained how different people came to faith. And even though Wesley himself believed that Scripture was the foundation of the life of faith, he was also aware that people came to faith by different means. Some came by tradition. They were raised in the church. Their families and communities found it important, so they stayed and were steeped in its ways. Some came to faith by reason. They considered the intricacy of the world, the need for community, the healing nature of prayer and meditation, the history and scholarship in the church, and they wanted to know more. So they came in by the reason door. And there are some came in who had a powerful spiritual experience of the living God. They had a mystical connection and came to the church to ground it and learn more. However people came to faith from whatever direction, once they were connected, they had more opportunity to learn about the others. They learned that logic and questioning is not a bad thing. They learned that tradition needs to make room for contemporary experiences of faith. They learned that Scripture is a gift to both hearts and minds. And they learned that the living Spirit of God catches people in powerful and personal ways. In all the ways that God was doing a new thing in this era, we hearkened back a couple of centuries to find a renewed way to understand the faith that we shared. There were some great songs written in this decade. Bryn had a whole list. This one is about living with the mystery of God, who is more than we can imagine. Creator God, you gave us life.